Hola, mi clase. So this is part 2. We're still solving one-step equations, but we're going to have rational numbers in them. So just as a reminder, rational numbers are numbers that can be written as a ratio. It's a comparison of two numbers, A over B. It's just another term for fraction, but instead of parts of wholes, it could be any two numbers I want to compare. So we're going to use inverse operations. We are going to allow you to use a calculator as long as you still show your work of what you are doing, because we're trying to decide, can you solve an equation, not can you add and subtract decimals and fractions, right? That's a old concept. All right, so if this is subtraction, the inverse would be addition. So we're going to add 9 1/10 to both sides. So I would get x equals, and then I have 12 8/10 negative. I'm going to add 9 1/10, and so we get negative 3 7/10. Even though we're letting you use a calculator, please make sure you're kind of doing some estimates in your head. This is a negative, this is a positive, greater absolute value, I should get a negative. If you don't, we have a problem. So try to make sure you're doing estimates in your head so that you know that you're getting the correct answer. So this is adding 3 2/10, so we're going to subtract 3 2/10 from both sides. Again, as long as you are showing your work, we do not care if you're using a calculator. And we get negative 11 7/10. Both of them are negative. I should get a larger negative. All right, so this one is the one that kind of tricks people. This is adding a negative, so technically we would subtract the negative, but as we know, a double negative becomes positive, so we really can just add 8 2/3 together, and so we get y equals, and we can leave it as a mixed 8 2/3. Okay, so you do not have to combine them if they don't need to be. Okay, this is combined. 8 plus 2/3 is 8 2/3. So technically, the inverse of adding is subtracting, but because I'm subtracting a negative, it's really the same thing as adding. So here we're going to subtract 3/4. We're going to subtract 3/4. I'm going to get n equals. Notice these are the same sign, so I'm just going to add them together and keep their sign. Negative 7 3/4. All right, this is a division problem. Inverse of dividing is multiplying, so we're going to multiply by 4/10. I'm going to go like this just so we kind of practice that skill. Technically, we should not have decimals inside of fractions, but it is okay for what we're doing right now. So y equals, I'm going to go negative 2 3/10. I'm going to multiply by 4/10, and I'm going to get negative 9 2/10. A negative times a positive is a negative. Alrighty, so this is multiplication. The inverse is division. So I'm going to divide both sides. This is where using a calculator will come in handy. Even though that is a half, we're dividing by a half. It's not the same thing as cutting things in half. It's actually negative 60 equals A, right? That's because half of 60 is 30. All right, we're going to divide by negative 3/4. All right, we're going to divide by negative 3/4. Remember, dividing by a negative or a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. You can keep the negative in the numerator. Unfortunately, your guys' most phones do not have a way to do a fraction unless you know how. So you may have to multiply across and then divide out the denominator just because, okay? Or reduce because most of them do not have a way to do this. So we would get positive, I apologize, positive 20, right? A negative times a negative is a positive. Of course, it's being really slow. There we go. 20 over 3, and we can actually just leave it like that because I don't need to worry about getting it in decimal form unless it asks me to. All right, so negative times a negative is a positive, and 5 times 4 is 20, and then 1 times 3. All right, so then we did a story problem. So it says a scuba diver exploring at an elevation of negative 12 2/10. As the diver rises to the surface, she plans to stop and rest briefly at a reef that has an elevation of -4 5500 meters. Find the vertical distance the diver will travel. So we're down here at -12 and 2/10. They are rising. Where's my word? Rising. So that means we're going this way. And we're going to stop at -4 and 5/10, right? This is my distance. So what they're asking is, what is this? Since we're rising, that's a positive. So our equation would be -12 and 2/10. Trying to get my decimal in there a little bit better. There we go. Plus x, because we're rising by an unknown distance, to get to a distance of -4 and 5500. So remember, if we're adding a negative, it's really the same thing as just adding the positive, adding the opposite of it. We're still doing an inverse. Okay. These are still inverses. These still cancel each other out. It's just because of that double negative that allows us to just add. So I'm going to go 4 and 5500 negative plus 12 and 2/10. And we get that they rose by 7 and 6500 meters. All right, so things to remember. Use a calculator, but with work shown. So if you just have an answer, it will be considered incorrect. Okay, and then just use inverse operations. All right, so here's your independent practice. I do expect to see what you're doing to both sides, just like I showed in the video. If it doesn't look like this, I'm gonna mark your notes incomplete. Please make sure you're showing your work. All right, until next time, adios.